Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Toby Dempker. Thanks for joining us for another podcast where we talk about personal, professional, and organizational development, a little bit of philosophy, and we basically pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. So enjoy the conversation today, and thank you for joining us. How are you doing today, Toby? Thank you for joining me.
Uh, Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm doing very well. It's very hot in Sweden at the moment, so I don't know if that brings a bit of laziness to the situation, but that's it's relaxing vacation times here, so that's I'm enjoying it myself. That's
Yeah,
good.
I never like to complain about the temperature, the weather, because especially in the northern, part of Europe that we live in.
Yeah,
You
well, we
know,
finally get it.
so now yeah, and obviously it doesn't help to complain about the things you have no control over. But I certainly agree. Some people love the heat, and for me, it's nice when you're on vacation, but when you're working, I prefer sort of moderate climate.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in Canada on the west coast, so it's although they've had a major heat wave in
Yeah, I
British
know.
Columbia and lots of fires. So hopefully everyone's doing okay there. But that's not what we're here to talk about. You've got a topic for us today. What would you like? What are we starting with?
Yeah, so I thought we could talk about decision making. Decision making, that's something that we in my classes on the MBA, we talk a lot about decision making, and because it's really important for managers and leaders, obviously. But interestingly, in coaching, I mean, it's a very highly sort of coaching relevant topic as well. Um, because in another course that I do, we talk a lot about decision making, and we go into coaching from that as a means of helping you to take better and wiser and more thought through qualitative decisions. So I'm also kind of curious to hear what you say as a coach to, so how can we support others in making better decisions, and what does it contain? I mean, it's a really big topic that relates to a lot of different things, but it's yeah. So let's see where it takes us, really.
Yeah, no, it's super. It's a big topic because there are so many elements, and I think I'm going to touch on a few things today. I think that relate to decision making choices in our lives, but also there are topics that I hope we'll probably do a session on. I mean, the big thing one of the first things when I think about choice and decision making is free will. Do we? You look at Sam Harris, who says we don't really have free will. Some people believe in sort of a mitigated free will, and I think we don't need to go into deeply into the philosophical part of it, but how much control do we have over the choices we make? And then the other part is sort of our cognitive bias, and I think the most important thing when it comes to decision making is just awareness around what's driving your decisions. Just to gain this, you make the best decisions when you can have the best clarity, and so I think a lot of that has to do with your systemic approach to the way you think about things,
Mm,
but also recognizing the biases that and how the environment and how you're being manipulated and all those kind of things. I think those really help to make healthier, like understanding your choice habits as well is a really important one.
mm,
So yeah, I think the thing is when people come to me for coaching, we maybe look at some of the historical patterns in their behavior, and then you look at what's they're not aware of the choices that they're making. They're aware of them afterwards when they reflect, but in the moment. So that's the way it is for
mm.
all of our habits, right? And we've talked
Yeah,
about habits before, and there's a big benefit to having that be not part of your conscious process, but it also leads us to getting into some patterns that are not helpful for us, and that includes our decision making patterns because those are also habits that we have.
yeah. And that's also interesting. I mean, in terms of how, at least in my experience, personally and with others, that in general, I would say that people are very seldom kind of regretful over any kind of decisions that they made. And I mean that can be, of course, part of the context and how you're thinking at the time, but also how biases, cognitive biases, can sort of have an effect of how we're thinking about the decisions post making them. So, it was a good decision, but also in terms of how much you learn from any kind of experience.
Mm.
So, we what I'm trying to say is, I guess that decision making is a really big topic. Sometimes I think that the decision we're looking in for and that we're struggling with, we make it a little bit too big, because whatever decision we're going to make, it's usually going to be fine anyway, depending on what it is, of course. But it's very seldom that we are regretful over any kind of decisions that we made, or maybe more that we didn't make in that case.
Yeah, I think it depends on the individual. There are some people who spend a lot of time ruminating on the past and wishing they made different decisions. I think the more confident you are and the more aware, when you start to recognize, well, you can't. There's nothing. I love the way Wayne Dyer used to say, there's nothing you can should have done, right? You can't. There's just
Yeah.
nothing about the past that you can change. And when you accept that and learn from those choices you've made and learn to make better decisions for the future, or learn to make decisions that are more in line with what your wants, needs, values are, that's important. You touched on the sort of the review. People will review their what the outcomes of their decisions. So that's kind of like a post mortem, kind of a regrouping, and did all the decisions go well. One thing that's really helpful, especially with the big life changing decisions or really monumental decisions in an organization, is to kind of do a pre-mortem, to play out, how the decisions are going to, what they're going to achieve, what are the possible outcomes. So I think
Hmm.
that's an important step to add to the decision-making process, depending obviously on how important they are. And I think the thing that really makes it difficult, some people are very decisive, especially in a leadership role. You need to learn to disseminate the information quickly and make decisions, whether it's an intuitive one or whether it's seeing the just having the top line view and not getting too caught
Mm.
up in the weeds of all the details. So some people can be really decisive that way. Certainly, your level of confidence plays a big role there, but then also that can create blind spots, right? So
Hmm.
it's a very nuanced and dynamic thing, the whole process of decision making, and it's
Mm.
important to look at all the elements. But the more choices you have, for some people, the more difficult it is, right? So for
Yeah.
the average person, if you can just make it a very binary, one thing or the other, that can be a little bit easier than you've got so many options, right?
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, if you talked about it making intuitive decisions, and clearly, I mean, most of the decisions that we make are intuitive. We don't even think about it. It's just, it happens. But if we can bring that awareness to the decision and make more rational decisions, I mean, then it becomes much more complicated. We think a lot about a lot more consequences, and in relation to other things, more systemic perhaps. Um, so what's interesting here is, when you're looking at leaders and teams, how they create processes around this. And this is something that I think is really interesting, especially for team dynamics or team development perspective. How What kind of ground rules do you have to set decisions? What decisions does the leader take? What kind of decisions should everybody be involved in? Do we have discussions about the decisions that need to be made, or is it a voting procedure? Or, as I experience in many companies, that the meeting itself, if we call it the meeting, it's just a formality. When you go into the meeting, the decision's already made. It happens in the hallways. Everybody's, chit-chatting away and getting people on board. And then when you go into the meeting, then you just actually make the formal decision, but the decision is actually already made. And that's a cultural thing, right? In
Mm.
different organizational cultures and national cultures, of course, as well. You have different processes of doing them, and it might be outspoken or non-outspoken. But I think for a team, it's really great if you have discussed it, thought about it, and have some ground rules of how we make decisions in this team. Because it creates, I mean, now we're talking a lot about the stuff that we've talked about before, like trust and transparency, and I mean, all of these things that makes a team click. But it has so much to do with decision making, and that kind of process is really can be very supportive of creating that trust and transparency and effectiveness in a team.
Yeah, I think if we're going to talk about it on a team level and an organizational level, I think it's really important to look at the Tannenbaum-Schmidt model of your leadership style and the levels of delegation. I think that's a really one to recognize, because not every decision is one for the group to make. Sometimes the
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
leader's got to. So it's how much authority do you want to delegate, and certainly in many cases, they're decisions that people should be making on an individual level, and they're passing off the responsibility to whoever is their manager or to someone in a leadership role, and people who aren't effective at delegating well tend to have, well, they tend to be overworked, and they tend to have
Mm.
carry all the weight on their shoulders, and then that takes away from some of the team dynamic. You need people being held accountable, being willing to take on responsibility, and so on. So depending on what the choice is, and do the people have the skills, the experience, the capacity to make those? Do they have all the relevant information? And I think that's a really important one for organizations and for individuals, making informed decisions, right? Making sure your decisions are well informed, and this is what I do on an individual coaching basis as well. Whether people are coming to me for professional coaching, business coaching, or for their own life, creating clarity first and foremost is going to help you find the right path forward.
Mm.
Sometimes too much more information, it's I think you can have all these complex models, you can have really really intricate strategies, but then you tend to forget the basics. I think remembering the
Mm-hmm.
basics is also really important, and so it's finding that balance, making sure you have enough information to have clarity, but
Mm.
not trying to know every possible eventuality, because that look at the things that you have control of, and those are the things you can decide on.
Yeah.
Everything else, let go of. It'll work itself out.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
those elements are super important in the whole process, whether it's personal or
Yeah.
whether it's organizational.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So I mean, in a lot of modern organizations that I come across, anyway, it's a lot of pressure on, especially leaders, that we have to make quick decisions, and they should be fact based. So having any kind of support process of excuse me, to get as many facts as you can into the equation, and then try to make sound decisions on that, and then to have some kind of tools that can help you. I mean, you have the Vroom Yago what's it called, decision making tree to
Yeah,
kind
decision
of
tree.
to support you, and how in this situation, what kind of how much should you involve the others in decisions, etc. But just looking at how much fact you have, how much experience you have, and also maybe some kind of mentoring process can be really helpful in this situation where you have really experienced experienced people in the organization that can support you. So there are a lot of different variations of support systems that can help you with this, but it's becoming like a real leadership skill to be able to make them fast and has as much fact as possible to make them.
Yeah, I think
So I
that.
think it's also important, this part of inclusion, right? To including different different perspectives, different ideas, different consequences, etc. So really involving people in that conversation as well.
Yeah, I think there's a number of questions you can be asking yourself, whether in an organization as a leader. Are you the right person who should be making the decision? Are you do you even have the insight to because there could be people more on the front line of a business that are in a better position to make that decision or at least inform your decision, and then on a personal level, people making their own individual choices and decisions in life. Do I have all the information I need, or do I even need to make that decision right now? There are people who, and I've found this about myself because I do a
Mm,
lot of work around visualizing, how I want the sort of future to unfold and so on, so I can internalize it and intuitively get the right impulses. But sometimes I'm trying to figure out choices. I spend energy on trying to make choices or that I don't even need to make right now because
mm,
other things need to unfold before I even make that choice. So
yeah.
so that can be part of the decision tree in an organization. Do we need to decide this now? And so sometimes you're putting the cart before the horse. So there's a lot of questions to be asking yourself in the process.
Mm,
But at the end of the day, what am I trying to? If you're choosing, you're narrowing things down. So what am I trying to define here? What am I trying to narrow down? What has to be made now, and what do I still need more information on, or what still needs to be clarified, or what still needs to unfold before I can make that decision? So
mm,
timing is a big part of it, but just asking yourself the right questions along the lines of, do I need to decide this now? Do I have all the information that I need? Is this even relevant? Prioritizing. Are there other choices I need to make before I make this decision?
mm,
Lots of different things to look at. But
yeah.
I think a really important one that people get caught up in is they look at they right away put things in a box. They have constraints. They put limitations,
Mm,
and that's where it becomes more difficult to, because a lot of the decision making is either trying to mitigate problems and challenges, like to kind of avoid them for the future, or you're coming up with a challenge and now you've got to decide what to do. And so we sometimes look at the choices or the options we have in a very narrow framework. And so
mm,
for people who are thinking about a life-changing decision, whether it's changing their relationship status or their job, or any of the big kind of decisions we make in life, I always encourage them to step out of the situation, to get themselves out of their normal environment, so to help give them a broader perspective. If you can, take the weekend off, go away,
mm,
to spend some time meditating, or whatever you can afford yourself. But not everybody can just when they have a big decision to make, take a vacation. But
mm,
finding a way to have a more sort of a bigger view, or remove yourself from within the storm, if you will, in order to that you can have a more objective view of things, rather than just only seeing what's right in front of you. So not being able to
mm,
see the forest for the trees, sort of thing. So I
yeah.
think you can do the same in the business or in private, just finding ways to take a step back and look at the big picture. And that's where I really encourage the systemic approach, right? Systemic
Mm,
principles, say you can zoom in on the different parts of the whole problem. You can zoom
yeah.
out, you can look at the big picture, and then you can start to recognize the relationship. And that's where, when I talked about doing the pre-mortem, or the sort of the analysis of where these choices could lead you, that's a really important one, because you can start to look at how different things affect each other. And so, look, in
Mm,
everything in life, I'm always encouraging people to look at things from a systemic perspective, because most times people are looking at cause and effect. They're like, well, if I do this, this will likely happen. And
Yeah.
This could get in the way, but they're not looking at the sort of all the other influencing factors or the things that could be affected by a choice, and that's usually where people don't aren't able to anticipate as well. When you look at things
Mm.
systemically, you can have a better sense of what the overall effect will be rather than just on the one. And this is where I sometimes see an issue in science. And look, science has a lot of really important things for us, but sometimes, especially as we involve, we have so much information to process. People become very specialized, and
Yeah.
they can't see beyond their one element of a problem or the one solution that they think they have. And so if we can encourage people to think more systemically, both privately and professionally, the world would be a better place, in my view.
That's a bold statement, but sure. Yeah, no, um, I mean, I think I also, all right, I know that in my job, I work with a lot of organizations that are very kind of engineer driven. And I think as engineers, we're very often schooled to, find the root cause, look at cause and consequences, as you're saying, and maybe to some extent not neglecting, but not paying as much attention to emotional issues, emotional facts. And when we're talking about decisions that are having an impact on people, I mean, we all know that emotions are uh, is a very, like it or not, it's a very, very important factor in decisions and consequences and how we're going to react to different things. So I think it's, of course, the relational part of that is really, really important. And by asking these kind of as a coach, of course, asking these kind of both zooming in and zooming out kind of questions, but especially these relational kind of questions are so powerful and interesting, like, so, I mean, as a stakeholder, how would this person react to this kind of decisions? Or if you were another person, how would this person sort of look at or approach this decision,
That
etc. So
that's a really good point, and I'd almost forgotten about this one in relating to this topic, because the state that you're in. That's another good question to ask yourself. Am I in the right state to make this decision right now? Right? People will make
mm,
emotional, reactionary decisions, and there was an interesting study done years ago, looking at parole judges. They were judging whether someone would be paroled from their prison sentence or not.
yeah,
And so time of day made a huge difference in the number of approvals for parole. And
mm,
so because people talk about there's a level of fatigue in choice making.
mm,
That it's controversial. I don't know that we have a definitive answer on whether ego depletion is a real thing or not. But certainly these judges, they found, so as they got closer to lunch and got hungry,
mm,
the sort of approval rating went down. And then once they came back from lunch and were regenerated and their hunger was addressed, it got more positive. And then closer to the end
yeah,
of the day, as they were getting fatigued from a full day of making these decisions, they got worse again. So it's really important to recognize the state that you're in, and whether if you're in a leaders go through a lot of stress, and if you're really stressed and you're worried and you're not feeling sure, sleep on it.
mm,
And I don't think there's any shame. And some leaders feel like they need to have all the answers and they need to be able to make decisions on the spot. And there are cases where that's required. But if there's the opportunity to delay if you recognize in yourself that you're not in the right frame of mind to be making a decision, don't let yourself be pressured into making it now. Even if you say,
mm,
I'll call you back in 5 minutes, or if you can sleep on it. And this is also true in people's private lives. When I talk with individuals that I'm coaching privately, it's like, are your decisions being made? Are your decisions being made out of fear?
mm,
Is fear a factor in because the none of the good decisions we ever make in life are fear-based. Fear will
Mm,
always get us, away from what we don't want, but it won't take us towards what we do want. And so, and fear tends to be very reactionary. So, recognizing that the state that you're in is really important, regardless of the situation, and being able to pause and go and regroup yourself so that you can,
mm,
I wouldn't have made that choice, and if I wasn't in that situation, right? And
mm.
that's not something that you want to be saying, right? You want to be able to gather yourself and clear your head and gain a sense of awareness, and some people can maintain that cool in any kind of pressure situation, but only few people can, even if they don't
Yeah.
show it. And
Yeah, exactly.
so when you recognize your emotional state and the kind of things that could be influencing your decision making, it's really, especially for important decisions, right? It's important not to lose your control emotionally. We all are affected by our emotions, and our physical state affect our ability to make good, healthy decisions.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can totally, as a reflective type, kind of introvert, I recognize that so much that I really want to take some time and sleep on my decisions, and then I can, if I've thought it through and I become more, uh, should I say assertive, but I'm very, very certain of what I think is a wise decision in this situation. It's so much easier to make the decision, but also to argue for the decision. That this is why I think this is right, and that's also a great. It's great for confidence, but also for for relationships. How you can uphold your decisions towards others and talk about it.
Yeah, and I also don't really believe in mistakes. I think the choices we make where we don't like the outcomes are really just learning opportunities, right? And that's why
Mm,
any good leader will encourage. I've heard a lot of leaders that'll talk about, um, fail often,
fail fast. Yeah.
fail fast, fail often. And I mean, obviously, if people are making the same mistakes over and over again, that's an issue. But every mistake that you're making for the first time is a learning opportunity. And so the thing is to treat yourself the same way as people in your team, whether it's your personal or professional life, and to recognize that you always make the best decisions you can with the information you have. So all you can do is put yourself in the best position. That means good mental health, lowering your stress levels, the pace of your life. If you can control all of those things, then the rest of your choices are just based on how much do you know right now, and how much,
Mm,
there are no guarantees in life. And when you can let go of certain outcomes, then you'll be a lot more comfortable making those decisions.
mm. Yeah, definitely. Um, but that was interesting what you said about yeah, the parole officers. I think there's a lot of, I'm not sure, but I think that might be apart from Donald Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
I think it was
Um,
in there. I've heard it raised on a
yeah,
few talks. It's been referred to a number of times for sure.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've always thought about that, and like if I'm in that situation, I hope I'm not on the Friday 11 a.m. slot. That's kind of where you don't want to. Anyway, in that book, I think I mean, he brings a very interesting perspective on decision making. I mean, he's clearly an authority on the topic, and
One
lots of interesting stories
he
and examples.
he won the Nobel
Yeah,
Prize, so
yeah. So
pretty profound work.
yeah, I guess that qualifies. No, but because also when you're talking about fear-based decisions and how you're affected by others, and that's again, if I'm relating to it personally, I can very much. I don't know if that has to do with empathy or anything, but it's very easy for me to kind of listen to someone and be very easily affected by his or her reasoning for a decision, and sort of go to different situations. So he talks a lot about in his book that if you're in a team, it's really important that each one in the group or in the team, writes down what my decision would be in this situation first.
Mm.
So you have a clear idea of this is what I think before you start listening to everybody else, because then you're just going to be effective. And that's also interesting to see, okay, so what am I focusing on and what do I think is important? And what does everybody else think? And how is that affecting myself? What is actually most important in this decision? And this is something that I've been using with a lot of teams, and I've been doing facilitation. So write down what you think first, and then we'll see. Um, and very often, I find that there are a few. Very often, the leader who is very charismatic, or has a certain authority in the group, but that influencing power is really, really strong. And sometimes it's good if it's based on experience and more perspectives, etc. But it can also be really supportive for the group if everybody has their own personal idea first. This is what I think. This is what I think important, and then you can have a constructive discussion about it, right?
Yeah, especially because different personality types, and there are people who can really dominate a conversation, and they can, especially if you have a lot of selling skills, it becomes very easy to then convince everyone in the room. Whereas if you've made those decisions, I think that's a really good approach, because people who are less sort of extroverted and or who aren't as comfortable sharing their opinion in a group, and let's face it, we live in a society that rewards a lot of extroversion, a lot of people who are willing to be those go-getters, be vocal, really not afraid to express their opinion. But those aren't always the best ideas, right? So, so I agree. That's a really good approach to it when you're talking about group decision making. And there are decisions that will be beneficial if there's consensus. And there's not always wisdom in crowds. Sometimes you as the leader will know better the decision to make, because people have their own individual priorities or their agendas and so on. So yeah, again, it's about what's the decision being made, and who is the relevant person to make that decision. And that's where, again, coming back to the Tannenbaum-Schmidt model, where we look at you've got the delegation poker, right? So whether you're just asking people for their advice, or whether you're completely delegating and giving other people autonomy to make decisions. It depends on what it is that you're deciding on, and how much time should we? People get really bogged down with thinking too hard about choices that have minimal effect, right? I think that's another thing to look at in your decision making is, how much time should I be, which I'm at the store, which brand of, toothpaste should I buy? If you're spending 10 minutes, then you're probably getting caught in the weeds a little too much, right? So just, what's the level of importance on any particular topic that you're trying to decide on? I think that's a really important one. But to get back to Daniel Kahneman and his work, I mean, his work's has a lot to do with cognitive bias or unconscious bias, and I think a lot of organizations are looking at that now too, because you'll find leaders in their hiring processes, they'll be looking for a bunch of like-minded people. We see it all the time. Especially the polarization in politics, where people, there's this bubble that people get into, and they gravitate to opinions that are just like their own, and you'll see it on the algorithms in social media, and the videos people watch. They'll keep getting recommended the things. So it creates this echo chamber, and that's not healthy in an organization. Diversity of ideas is really, really important. And so I think it's if we can start to become aware of those unconscious biases that we have in the decision making, especially something like hiring, right? So if you you'll be more successful if you have a real diversity of ideas within your group, within your team. and you'll have a better problem-solving ability. Otherwise, you're just going to take a one-sided approach to everything. And so I think that becoming aware of your unconscious bias is really important, and Kahneman does that really, really well. Obviously, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow is a must-read. And so where I like to go with that is to start to recognize your decision-making habits, right? And you know, when people are marketing and looking at consumer habits, it becomes very easy to recognize the things that prompt people to buy something, right? That influence their decision. So we live in a world now where we're constantly, everybody's, you know, looking to get our attention. It's an attention economy almost now. You know, it's, you know, how many clicks, how many likes, how many. By the way, if you haven't subscribed and liked this video, please do. But for sure, we're getting these prompts all the time, and so recognizing that. So if you want to make better decisions for you, whether it is in business or in your personal life, recognize where you're being manipulated or where you're being prompted, and you can only do that by looking below the surface at your habits of decision making, and then even starting to look at, well, why am I making those decisions? You know, people make unconscious choices all the time, and when you can, you know, just take a minute to look at some of those, it's really helpful. And that's especially with professionals in the coaching process. Looking at the choices you make and what's driving them is a real big part of being successful in life and professionally.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting with organizations, and I mean, when you're talking about cognitive diversity in teams, we all know that. I mean, if you're working with creativity in any kind in teams, that's really, really important. And of course, organizations are looking at this, and everybody's aware of the importance of creating this kind of diversity. But on a measuring basis, I find that a lot of companies I mean, it's easier to measure, say, gender equality and equality in pay and these kind of things that are, it's more figurative facts that you can look at and measure. And this diversity of opinion and ways of thinking, cognitive diversity, is much more difficult to measure, and it can be uncomfortable to manage as well. So it's a real challenge, I think, for organizations.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see how, you know, some organizations are looking at blind, what do you call it in English? Like blind hiring. If you have a bunch of resumes and you can't know names and gender and age, etc., and just look at skills and background, and that's one way of helping in that way. But it's a tough one.
I'm not a fan of like quota hiring. I think the important thing is, I think the idea of doing those blind initial sorting out, so that you're looking at qualifications, you can remain unbiased based on people's appearance or gender and so on. Absolutely, that's important. But I think the outcome needs to be a diversity of ideas. If you're just going, well, we need to have X amount of people of this ethnicity or this gender or whatever, I mean, that undermines. Think about a woman who's worked really hard to get into her position, and then another woman is hired just to fill a quota. I mean, who's being unfairly treated here, right? So I think that needs to be handled with nuance. And I think the other thing is, a lot of companies now, they're being rated on this SEG score, right? This social responsibility, equity, and governance. Sustainability, equity, and governance. I can't remember the exact acronym, but anyway, they have this SEG score, and so that's why you'll see these big companies that will do these very woke advertising, talking about all these catchphrases, and it'll be very superficial. It'll be just, well, we want to get a good SEG score because that affects, investment, shareholder value, all of that stuff. So it's important to recognize that that's driving it. I think what's important is, if you're going to build a healthy culture, having that diversity mindset is really important. Obviously a meritocracy where you see people based on the value they bring, the ability they have, or the potential that they have, and that's irregardless of race or gender or any of the categories you want to put people in. I think that is going to make you a strong organization, but also on a personal level. If you can start to take people at face value, for the soft skills, the qualities they have, the connection you feel to them, or just the things that you have in common rather than the differences that you have, I think then we'll avoid some of the tribalism that evolves and the us and them, and that's very strong. I mean, I've mentioned Robert Sapolsky before, but he looks at a lot of about the way our neurochemistry will affect our behaviors. But a lot of people they think that, for example, not serotonin. What's the bonding? Oxytocin. Oxytocin is the thing that the neurochemical that's that bonding thing between mother and child, and when we embrace someone, we produce some oxytocin. But what he points out is that oxytocin also spikes when you have these clearly us and them kind of, when you're like strengthened in, when there's extreme nationalism and this is our team versus their team, and that desire to then beat or even harm the other. Anytime you're making it, there's the us and the other, right? So I think we're kind of getting off the topic with decision making here, but I think recognizing all those biases that you have, and recognizing that if you have in your social circle, if you have diversity of ideas, diversity of personalities, you'll be better for it. And same when your organization, your team, and that will lead to making better decisions, better choices.
Yeah.
Right? If you're if you're caught up with people who all have the same political view, all have you'll be very biased, and the choices you make, that people who have certain consumer habits because they're driven by, I've got to have the nicer car, I've got to follow we're all those, people are being very manipulated to be consumers, right? And so if you can have diverse people in your social circle, diverse people in your workplace, then you'll start to see, actually, I don't have to live that way, or there are other choices I can make, and it takes some of the pressure off to be like the sort of influencer group. I mean, imagine this term influencer, even that has such value, to be an influencer, and what that means, right? And so, if you want to be less influenced and less manipulated, and be, if you can work more on the internal signals rather than the external ones, you'll live a happier life. And in organizations, you'll obviously, being aware of the environment and being empathetic and all of that, but you will know the right decisions to be making. And so if you can construct your decision-making habits in a way that you don't always have to be thinking about them, but you're aware of your biases, so that you can, you can step in when you're getting caught up in one of your old habits that is leading you to a decision that you don't like. And again, that's professional or business life. So a level of awareness is going to be the cure for a lot of bad decisions.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm thinking, how this can support you. I'm thinking more from the organizational perspective. If you're in a leadership or a manager position, and you're finding it difficult to work with decisions, how this kind of, I guess you can call it a systemic approach, by looking at the diversity and around you, in your team, cross-functionally around you, who are the influencers, what kind of perspectives are you lacking, how can you maybe shift a few processes to allow more diversity in diversity of perspectives to support you to make more sound, sustainable decisions. Sure. And I think here, all big organizations are talking about diversity and inclusion in different ways, but still, I think we can see just from this conversation that there's such a long way to go. It's very easy to talk about and implement different uh, promotions and perhaps processes or strategies to enhance diversity and inclusion, but to really take full advantage of it to make it work, it really comes down to to each individual, and there's a long, long way to go there. There's a lot of obstacles, but we have to keep working on them.
Absolutely. And I think for leaders, it's important to remember that you're only as strong as your team, right? And so,
Yeah.
the people who still want to hire yes people, yes men, yes women, yes people, that just want people to agree with them, they're never going to have the best outcomes.
Mm,
And so I think that whole thing about looking at things from different perspectives, the systemic approach, that all leads to the whole diversity piece as well.
mm,
And we will, when we have a diversity of ideas, we will make better decisions, not just for
mm,
us as individuals, but for an industry, for the planet, for any of these choices that we're making. When we start to look at it systemically and we have diverse opinions, we're going to
mm.
start to make the best decisions.
Yeah. And also here, and cultural, we talked a little bit about culture, but not only organizational culture, but also very much if you look at nations and national cultures, that really plays a big role in this sense as well. I mean, when if a leader needs to take decisions, how much are you allowed to challenge your leader, to challenge that decision, to argue and have a debate about I mean, you know my background in China. If you're working in a state-owned company organization in China, you're not going to challenge your boss. I mean, that's that's something that you don't do. However, in Holland, for instance, I mean, they're very um, on that. I forgot what scale it's called. There's if you look at Hofstede's different cultural perspectives, I think it's yeah we were talking about power distance.
Hmm.
I mean, then Holland is very very low on power distance, and I find also personally that Dutch people are very open for debate and I mean a challenging constructive debate, and you can challenge whoever you want, and it doesn't matter who in the hierarchy, etc. And it's a very very different climate for what for yeah how do you allow different kind of decisions, and that really plays a role as well, right?
Absolutely, culture is a big one. Obviously, Asian cultures there is a lot more showing respect, and the sort of established hierarchies are really important. Whereas, like, as you say, in a country like the Netherlands, where the where you look at how direct the communication is, and then there's a scale. So on the one side, you'll have the Dutch, you'll have the Swiss and the Germans, like to varying degrees. And look, these are generalizations. So not everybody in that culture is going to be that way. There's introverts,
Of course,
extroverts,
yeah.
and so on. But generally speaking, like you're right about the Dutch. They're very direct, but they don't take offense easily. They're not afraid to offend you, and but that makes for really healthy debates. And so it's really shocking. It was for me coming from the Canadian culture, which is almost three-quarters of the way over towards the Asian style of communication, where there's a big emphasis on being polite, and those all are good qualities as well. Don't
Mm,
always make for effective communication, though. So
mm,
so culture does play a big role. So being willing to in group decision making, being willing to challenge the status quo, and that's another thing where I talked about the constraints and the limitations we put on the options when we're trying to make a decision, right? And
mm,
so sometimes a leader will put the options on the table, and those are the only ones you're allowed to look at.
mm,
Whereas if you're allowed to if you're allowed to think outside the box and come at it from a different, that's when you're going to be able to be innovative.
mm.
And coming back to my point about taking a step back, I think about someone as brilliant as Albert Einstein. And now when you think of brilliant, he's kind of the go-to guy. But
Yeah.
he would he would go for, when he got stuck on a problem, he would go for a long walk in nature. He would he would do something creative like play his violin,
Mm.
and so again, it's step away from the problem or step away from the decision you're trying to make, and that goes as a group as well, right? So especially when you're trying to find consensus, and consensus is usually the worst thing. You need to vote for the
Mm.
best idea, not have consensus, not making compromises that you're probably not going to come up with the best thing. But if you've got different cultures and you've got different ideas and you're trying to hash something out, sometimes take a break. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and
Mm.
people come together and they'll have a fresh view of things. So
Mm.
there's lots of there's lots of complex dynamics to be working with when you're making group decisions,
Yeah,
and and
yeah, definitely.
and a leader needs to be aware of those. Otherwise, you can debate things. People sometimes will talk for the sake of hearing their own voice, or they feel that
Mm.
that's they need to say something, to be heard. And you can look at things from 1,000 different ways, but you've got to go back to the basic. What's the important stuff we need to cover here? So all
Mm.
of those
Yeah, and how much?
dynamics. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and also looking at the resources. I mean, time is probably the most scarce resource in this time. That yeah, we have to make really quick decisions, so we don't have time to debate for. And going back to that cultural perspective again, so, I mean, in China, there's a really strong acceptance for the leader decides we're totally fine with that. In Sweden, that would not be accepted. We need to be involved, and we need to have Sweden is a consensus based kind of culture in that sense that we need to agree, and things are so slow. So if you're looking at the Swedish Sino relationship, those kind of things are driving the Chinese crazy when it comes to Sweden, and vice versa. Like you have to take a qualitative decision and involve everybody else. So it's very different levels of acceptance of how you make decisions in these different cultures.
And it was a big culture shock when I came from Canada to Germany, because
Mm,
you get a lot of these unsolicited opinions. You'll be you'll be walking your dog and someone will make a comment about you. Well, you should be doing something differently. It's like, mind your own business, right? I mean, that's kind of something that you would expect, whereas here it's very commonplace. And culturally, that you're right. I mean, the degree to which people are willing to voice their opinions. And I think in Germany, I think at the school level even, you're very encouraged to have your own opinion, which I think is really healthy, rather than
mm,
groupthink and going along with the herd. So so yeah, I can imagine where those, like, Swedish or German or Dutch culture would really clash with some of the Asian things. But even within these cultures, working within, whether it's a German organization or even a group of friends, right? I mean, sure, there'll be people who are, everybody will have an opinion, and people may be more decisive, but you'll always have people that are still not comfortable. Or if you're in a leadership role, and you've got less experienced people, they may not be comfortable making those decisions. So it's about
mm,
how quickly can you get them to a comfort level where they can have a certain degree of autonomy. Otherwise, if you've got to
mm,
decide everything, and especially these micromanagers, I mean, I don't know if it still exists to the degree that it used to, but people who need to control every little you're never going to be an effective leader that way, right? So
no.
encouraging people to take some degree of responsibility and to take on, these are the decisions you can make, these are the decisions that I'd like you to consult me on, and these are the decisions you
Mm,
absolutely cannot make, and I'm going to decide. Having
yeah.
having that within an organization is really important, and even on a personal level, right? Just knowing
Mm,
what decisions are okay for you to make in your relationships. What do you need to
mm,
consult with your partner on? You'll save yourself a lot of stress
mm.
in a partnership if you're checking on what decisions are okay for me to make on my own.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I I think about and talk a lot about obviously motivation, transformational leadership, and these things, and how to delegate effectively, and what you need to do and what you don't need to do if you're actually delegating, and this, and especially this thing that, as I think a lot of leaders do that mistake, that they delegate the important things to the same person all the time, So you're developing this individual to become autonomous and taking his or her own decisions while you're kind of neglecting the rest of the group. But thinking about that in private life, I haven't really thought about that so much. What kind of decisions do I need to take myself, and what kind of decisions do I need to involve my family in? I'm just thinking of something simple as, okay, if we're gonna decide on a vacation, where to go for vacation or something like that. How much should I involve them, and how much should I just make my own decisions? Obviously, budget has something to do with it as well. But
Yeah, it's about also being considerate, and I think that, like, for years, being single, I planned all my work trips as needed, and
mm,
now even if even if my girlfriend doesn't, I can't be, asking her for permission. Can I go on this trip? That's certainly not the case, but I can communicate. So there's, would it be better if I take this trip this week or this other week? If there's that
yeah,
degree of flexibility. And so, I think now just, people like to be considered, right? So even though you may not be giving some other person the power of that decision, sometimes it's just great to get their input,
mm,
even though you're the one who's got to make the decision yourself. So,
mm,
and so that can be, and that works well between colleagues, right? That's why the RACI model, consulting, like there's so
mm,
much, so many problems could have been avoided if you would just said, "Listen, I'm going to go ahead with this thing, just so you're aware of it." I mean,
mm,
communication about the decisions you're trying to make are also super important, because you may be missing a valuable piece of information. And for me in my personal life, it's like, well, she might say, well, don't forget it's so and so's birthday. Do you really want to be away? Or, just something like that, right? And or
mm,
we've got an important appointment, or something like that. So I think those are all things that that are, communication, and it comes back to making sure you have all the information that you need,
yeah,
by consulting all the right people.
yeah. And that's also a good point when it comes to organizations. I mean, we can see in organizations that sometimes there are very big decisions to be made, but when the and I this relates to what I talked about before, like when the actual decision is made. But if there's a situation like there's going to be a big structural change in the organizations, and that decision has to be made, but then when the decision is actually finalized and finally sort of confirmed, everybody already knows about it. It's
Mm.
like, yeah, this is not such a big deal. And in these kind of situations, it might be that the organization has been really good and really effective in communicating and checking in what other people think. And then when the decision is made, it's like a no-brainer. Okay, yeah, of course we're gonna do this, right?
Mm.
Instead of having this instant shock of what's happening.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
that, and the whole thing about asking people for their input, it makes them feel like they have some degree of influence, and
Mm,
it's like they don't feel victim to the system. And that actually, that's a really important point, especially for for individuals in their private life, but also within organizations where people are feeling helpless. You get people who fall into this kind of victim trap, right? I'm a victim of and they don't recognize the choices that they've taken that have led them there. They're pointing the fingers at others, or they don't want to take responsibility. It's own your choices, own the decisions that you make, and there are no, there are going to be things out of your control. You are going to make mistakes. There's nothing wrong with that, right?
mm,
But unless you take ownership of the decisions that you're making in life, or in a business or whatever, the less you have the ability to learn from those decisions that you've made, right? The less you are aware of the amount of power you have with the choices that you make. The more you relinquish that power, the more helpless and out of control you'll feel. And on a personal level, when people say, I'm only one person, I don't have the ability to change anything in the world. It's
mm,
like, well, you're part of the most powerful group in the world. Really?
mm,
What group is that? You're a consumer. And
Mm.
consumers, billions are spent on trying to understand consumers. And I heard there was a documentary I was watching once, and they were talking about every time you scan this item, you're voting for that.
Yeah, exactly.
So if I'm buying organic, I'm voting for that. And
Mm.
so the same goes for any other choices that you make. It's like, well, everybody does it or whatever. But if there's a if or I'm only one of how can my choice make a difference? Well, by your choice, you are voting for that thing. And so I think it's important to recognize the power that our choices have, and we're not as helpless as we think. And then just recognize, okay, what do I have control over? Sometimes we try and control other people or control situations that it's impossible for us to influence. And so
Mm.
let those choices go. Don't worry about those. Don't spend mental energy on them. Look at the choices you can make and make the most out of those. Make sure they're well informed, and make sure you're doing them not out of fear, for the right reasons. And the same in organizations. What am I? Is this serving some kind of agenda I have, or some kind of fear that I have, or is this how I want to be adding value to the organization? And how, from
Mm.
a systemic perspective, how are my choices affecting the rest of the team, the rest of the organization? What could be the potential outcomes? And the more awareness we have around that, and the less we feel like a victim of circumstances because we haven't participated in the process of decision making,
Mm.
the more empowered we'll feel.
And also going back to where we started the whole series of these conversations that we're having when we're talking about purpose, to understanding what is the most important thing, what is the purpose, what is the biggest goal or objective that we're trying to achieve, and in making this decision, how will that support that, and finding that alignment. So how what whatever choice I make, what will have the biggest supportive effect on the purpose or the objective that we're trying to achieve. And I see some leaders that are so good at this. I mean, yeah, so challenging. How is this going to support this? And how is this going to support this? And then only by looking at that question, it makes the decision so obvious. Oh, of course we should do this, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So purpose is important. We also talked about values, and
yeah.
values really, they drive behaviors, but they also drive our decision making. So, am I being true to my values? Because if
Mm.
there's incongruence there, we're not going to be happy, and we're probably not going to be successful. So, whether it's personal or professional, so recognizing, am I making choices based on my values, or am I reacting to fear or peer pressure, or the pressure of the group? I mean, a lot of bad decisions are made. Look at the situation we're in now, where you've got a health crisis, right? And because of the whatever pressures, because of fears, because of whatever, there are some good choices being made, and there are also some really, you question whether that's been well thought out. And I'm
Mm.
not an expert in that area, but I'm just saying that that if you can look at what's driving your choices, it's gonna be really 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 beneficial and important to having the clarity to make the best possible decision for yourself and for
Mm.
others.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's a super interesting coaching topic. I mean, if you're
Big
having
time.
coaching conversations that are related to decision making, I don't know what to do. Okay, well, let's support you. And also, I'd say in some of the projects that I'm driving, we're doing this as a group coaching activity. So if you're it's kind of an action learning activity, but if you when you're having a leadership challenge or a problem with the decision making and you don't really know what to do, to gain these perspectives from various different leaders and managers, uh, that can also be super interesting because you gain these perspectives and you have time to look at different kind of consequences and sort of analyze that, and also the emotional impact. I mean, you always get these kind of questions coming in, so yeah, it's a fun one.
Absolutely. So I guess we could probably wrap up, and maybe summarize, because look, I think we could. This is another one of those topics we could talk endlessly about, because look, choices make such a huge impact on our lives. I mean, it's the
Mm.
path we take through life is driven by
Yeah.
our choices, right? So I guess from your, you've done a lot of educational stuff and you've worked with a lot of teams and and leaders. So what are your some of your most important takeaways on decision making?
Mm. Well, I think as much like we talk about, it comes down to awareness and creating awareness about our decisions and having the first of all having the notion that we most of the decisions we made are driven intuitively, so we don't really think about them. But the ones that we're really struggling with, how can we create awareness and a support system around them to make as good decisions as we possibly can. The perfect decision maybe doesn't exist, so that's not important. Like, so what is the best decision that we can take in this situation, and having a support system around that, with your team, with people around you, with yourself, looking systemically, like you're talking about, looking at relations, looking at uh, rational issues, looking at emotional issues, and finding something that is in good alignment with that sits well with your values and your purpose of what you want to achieve. I mean, it sounds maybe that sounds easy. I don't know if it sounds easy because obviously it's not.
So there's a lot
But
there, but you can
yeah,
create
there's a lot there.
you can
But
create.
creating that network or context around you that will support you in making that decision, I think that's the key thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think what you're kind of pointing to is creating some good habits around your decision making process, and for me that includes a good level of awareness, like recognizing the state that you're in, recognizing what's driving you, looking at things that, like, what's prompting you, looking at the framing. Context is really important when you're making decisions, and looking at things. I talk endlessly about looking at things systemically. That's really important. Actually, there's one really interesting thing when geez, I'm trying to remember who this story came from, but it's called the Cobra effect, because in India they had a problem with too many cobras, too many wild cobras, and
Yeah.
so they gave this incentive of, well, for every dead cobra, there would be a financial reward. And then what this led to is, people, entrepreneurial, started breeding these cobras so that they could, as a financial model. And then when the government found out about it, they canceled the program, and all these people who were breeding cobras set them free, and now then there were more wild cobras than they had before. So this is, again, so there's, you talk about contemplating failure, right? So you can do that after the fact. So what have I learned? Or you can
Mm.
go, okay, what does success look like, or what are the possible pitfalls? And you can only do that when you look at it systemically. And that decision to give incentives, really, to reduce the cobra population, that's a very cause and effect thing. That's the opposite of systemic thinking, right?
Yeah.
So that's just, the systems thinking works. It's really important, and really recognize your inner signals. That's where your values are. That's where all of your experience is, and that's what's really gonna. I believe in coaching. One of my keystones to my coaching philosophy is everybody has the answer that they're looking for within them. It's just about
Mm.
finding it, and that's what the coaching process is about. It's really hard to analyze yourself and to try and dig through things. You can do all kinds of things, but a lot of people in their busy days don't have the time to use those tools on a regular basis. So a coach helps. So really learning those to follow those inner signals, and remember, don't be a victim. Take ownership. Take ownership of the choices you've made, the situations you've put yourself in, and from there you will be empowered to change your life going forward, to change your business, to change the way your organization functions, your team functions, and so on.
Mm.
And I think that would be kind of my short list of along with recognizing your biases. But that's all about that whole awareness process. And
Yeah.
read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a real eye opener, and it's been around for a long time, but there's a reason why it's still
Mm.
around, and lots of people are still reading it. So
Yeah, it's very enjoyable.
great. So
Interesting.
yeah, yeah. Again, an enlightening discussion. You always bring me to different ways of thinking about things. So thanks for joining
Likewise.
me
Yeah.
for another conversation. And I hope anyone listening has also benefited from our chat today. If you are inclined to do so, or if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. It helps us get out to more people. And if you are wanting to contact one of us, you can reach Toby through his LinkedIn page or me through my website, peterteuscher.com. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear any kind of suggestions for topics we should cover. And more than anything, we really hope these discussions add value to your life.
Mm.
So I think we'll leave it there.
Let's do that and see you in a few weeks with another interesting topic.
Absolutely. So enjoy the warm weather, and we'll talk to you in a few weeks. Thanks for joining us,
Yeah.
everyone. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.